Hello. Welcome everyone. My name is Christoph Bergmeister. This talk will be all about PSScriptAnalyzer. I'll give you an overview. If you've never heard of the tool before, I'll tell you what it is. If you've already used it, I will give you some very detailed usage of it and some advanced features. Show you how you actually don't care too much about the internals and use it integrated into VSCode, customize it to your use case. Talking a bit about internals and discussing some of the rules. As we've already seen a few hours ago, some people disagree with defaults and ask questions, can I customize it? And to give the answer away, yes, you can customize it. ScriptAnalyzer is a tool that allows you to define your coding standards. It's not a religion. You should be able to define whatever you think suits you best. It comes with a set of rules out of the box, but it allows you to customize so that it can cater for all your needs. A quick thank you to the sponsors, mainly DevOps Group, System Frontier, eSynergy Solutions, and TechSnips. So a bit about me. I'm a .NET developer working for a company called Willis Watson in Reigate, where a lot of insurance tech companies work. And if you're into development, operations, or the DevOps side of things, we usually always look for people. I started out as a developer, but then I got a bit more into CI, CD, automation, and testing. And this is kind of how I got into PowerShell. I found it's a very great tool. And I started contributing to the open source repos, one of them also being PSScriptAnalyzer. And then since the start of this year, I'm a community maintainer. So what does this mean? The module is owned by Microsoft, but they let community members contribute to it as well. Anyone can contribute in the sense of opening a pull request. As a community maintainer, it means I can improve and merge PRs in myself, but it still means there's a review process going on, so at least one person has to approve it. And due to the work that I've done in this space and in the PowerShell space, I became a Microsoft MVP a couple of months ago. Thank you. If you want to find out more details about me, I'm on Twitter, @Bergmeister, retweeting everything that is in the PowerShell or automation space, a bit also in the development, specifically C#. I occasionally blog. When I blog bigger things, I would blog it to the PowerShell scripting guy or on the PowerShell team blog directly. And most people know me from my GitHub handle here, or just that profile pic that I use everywhere. That I might change, as some people don't recognize me in real life, so it might be better to use an actual picture in the next months. So, talking about PSScriptAnalyzer, what is that thing that I will be talking about? So first of all, to get a bit of an idea, who of you in the audience have used PSScriptAnalyzer before? That is very good. How many of you use the tool as part of some CI/CD automation in terms of running it automatically? That is, we'll have a good mix of people, I think. So PSScriptAnalyzer is cross-platform. You can run it on Windows, Linux, and Mac. We run our CI/CD builds on Windows and Linux against Windows PowerShell and also PowerShell Core. At the moment, the support is for PowerShell version 3 to 6.0, and you can also use it in Docker. We have examples supplied on our GitHub repository. However, going forward, what I hear from the Microsoft side, they want to drop some of the support for version 3 and 4 to be able to iterate quicker, get rid of old legacy code. At the moment, it's still there, but in the future, support for 3 and 4 might get dropped, and we might see similar things happening in the VS Code extension space. The tool is open source, it's MIT, and contributions are welcome. So if you want to add a feature, if you want to fix a bug that annoys you, or if you think default behavior is not the right one, feel free to submit a pull request. We are very open to discussions. The current status is 250,000 installations with about 500 per day, which is probably an indicator that a few people use it in their automation pipeline. So an overview, what is the tool actually, if you have never used it before? Mainly it's code analysis, but it's also format and linter. many people have already used it or seen it. They might not be aware of it. So I'll point that out. So it's integrated into the PowerShell VS Code extension. So how many people have used VS Code for PowerShell development? Have you seen some squiggles when you write like GCI or ls? So that is this tool, and this is an indirect integration by a repository called PowerShell Editor Services, where the idea is we wrap all the analysis and editor services, and it could be Vim, it could be any other editor that we could integrate with. It just happens that VS Code, there's a lot of heavy development going on there, and this currently gives you the best experience. If you don't like to use the ISE, or if you're on Linux and Mac, you need a development environment, then the VS Code extension is the way to go, and this is where new features will go. The ISE will be maintained, but there won't be any new features in the ISE anymore. This is as far as Microsoft is concerned at the moment. I will show an integration of PSScript Help, which is a PowerShell module per se as well, wrapping Script Analyzer, adding a lot on top of this, and also offering a Azure DevOps extension, so that you could have one task in there, drop it in, works out of the box, no more setup, it installs Script Analyzer for you, gives you HTML report. I will demo this in this presentation. Script Analyzer itself is extensible. You can write your own custom rules to extend it, because some rules might not apply to the wider audience. They might be very specific to your company, and those custom rules could be design rules, but they could also be code analysis rules or naming standards, whatever you can think of. And those custom rules are mainly written in PowerShell. You can write them in C#, but this is a bit more tricky, not well documented. But mostly people write custom rules in PowerShell, despite the module itself being binary. And I will give examples of this as well. If you've already done some of that stuff and you want to do more advanced things or look at examples, one link will be to Injection Hunter. I will talk about this in this talk as well, written by the guy who is responsible for the security of PowerShell. His name is Lee Holmes. I will show this fully integrated into VS Code, and Thomas Reiner is very active in the open source space as well, and he has written a bunch of them and has got his own GitHub repository of them, which is very good to look at examples if you maybe want to make a slight modification to something. And he used to be an MVP, but now that he's joined Microsoft, he had to give up the title, but he's still very active and would be happy to help out if you've got questions about the rules that he wrote. So why do you want to use the tool? So it's about, we talked about best practices. So initially the tool came up 4 years ago from the PowerShell team. Microsoft was writing Azure Stack, which is I think 100,000 or 1 million lines of PowerShell, and they were encountering a lot of problems and they wanted to enhance the development experience. So the first idea was to come up with best practices, so they implemented rules to warn on worst practices. But then later on more rules got added, so it's about commandlet design, providing help, supports should process, security, how you use your script functions. There's certain known gotchas of certain functions. It can warn you, did you really mean to use it in this way? Script analysis in general, dead code analysis, script style in general, formatting. You can enforce, if you like, to have to brace on wherever you want the brace to be, the spaces where you want them. So this is the formatting aspect of it. And the end goal is, when you develop, you want to find your bugs very, very quickly. You don't want it to go through a build or even system test or deploy to production, because the expense gets up if you have to fix a bug. So the idea is fix it early on in the development stage for better development. And just to show in terms of commandlet design rules, even to Microsoft, it seems to be unclear sometimes because there's so much in the PowerShell space, you have to know so much. It has a steep learning curve, and not even Microsoft always gets it right. So there's always like pointers that you can give, and the idea is that that tool gives you pointers, or you could do this better or that better. But it's also not meant to be always 100% certain. You should always take it with a pinch of salt. You should evaluate it when it tells you, oh, there is a warning. Does it apply? You can suppress the warning if you think the usage is correct in your case. And actually, when you look at code analysis tools, like ones that ReSharper provides, the better the tool is, the more false positives you will have, and that's just part of life. If you want to catch a really nasty bug, then there might be some false positives, but you might catch a really, really nasty bug and fix it early on before it goes to production. So what I've opened here is one PowerShell file in VS Code. I have the VS Code extension installed. Out of the box version, all RTM, nothing customized. That's all stuff that you can get as well. So we can see squiggles on an alias here, which is a very common one. We could suppress it if we want to. A lot of people still use right host. So there is a rule around right host. In versions before PowerShell version 5, you could not redirect right host. And then it was cluttering it, and say if you had a commandlet at the end that was calling a lot of right hosts calls, you could not get rid of them. In version 5, they fixed it. So if you're in version 5 and you think the usage is okay, and it's for the appropriate scenarios, you can suppress it, which I've done here. And it just works by parsing the script, and that's why it needs at least a param that it knows it's a PowerShell function. So you have those attributes, and you can suppress on scopes, function scope, and so on. You can't suppress on a per line basis. The smallest one that we have is the script scope, where you can suppress a warning. So what I'm going to show as well, let's select this here, and I think the default formatting settings have brace on the same line. So press Ctrl KF, and it auto formats it for me. I can select the whole script, and it does it for me. And the way how that works, it's calling invoke formatter, which I will show in a bit. So that works all out of the box. I can show you later on also how to change the default to whatever you like. And I'm going to show you two use cases that happen quite frequently if you happen to switch languages like C# or Python, where you'd write, if something is greater than this, and then from C# or your language, you might be used to using the greater operator, but then at that point in time, you just forget it's a redirection, and what is going to happen is not what you intended to. So a new rule that I added in the latest release is this warning here. Are you really sure you meant that? Maybe you meant the greater equals operator. So this is a good example of catching it early on in development, a simple human mistake where you don't want to end up hitting the wrong code branch. So here you could have the same thing using the equals operator, but then we don't get a warning on it. But remember, I've actually added a rule for it. So what I'm going to show you, the default experience, and this is very important to know. The PowerShell editor services repos decided not to switch all of them on by default, and I'm currently working on them on slowly increasing the number of rules being turned on by default as they make sense. So I'm going to show you how an enhanced experience would look like. And by the way, if you were to change those rules, yes, you can change them, but there's a bug in the extension that it doesn't persist. So once you close VS Code, reopen it, your customization has been lost. But there is hope. I will show you how to persist it, set up a repository, so that anyone opening your repository will have it working out of the box how you like the developer to contribute to it. So let's open a second instance here in a different folder. And here we see it's warning me against this here. So how does this work? So the way how I propose things to work is check in the .vscode folder with details that I will show you at the root, so where a user would open VS Code in terms of his or her workspace. You can define an extensions.json file. So say if they don't have the PowerShell extension and they open the workspace, it will tell you, oh, this repository recommends using the PowerShell extension. So this way you get your users on board installing the extension if they have not done so. And the important part is the settings.json one. So here you can serialize all your settings, and you can specify a path to a script analyzer settings file, which I will show in a second, which is the settings path setting. You could also store here your default formatting style, where you want your braces to go, that I will demo as well later on. So those will be the settings that you can store here, and maybe this you should not check in, because it's up to the user which color theme that you want them to use. So the settings path here is a relative path, so this file here needs to be in the root directory, which is this file, and it works by using implicit settings, so just by giving it this special name. It also means if you were to run the tool from this root, it would pick up that file automatically. It's kind of convention over configuration. So this is a simple settings file, but you could even make it even simpler. Just do that, have it empty. What this will do, it will enable all rules. And this is usually how I like my repositories to be set up. I've added a couple of more parameters, like I'm excluding a certain rule, because I'll discuss this rule a bit later on, but this rule is a bit limited. Some people might decide to want to turn it off at all completely. I would not recommend it, but it depends on the use case, on that person as well. And what I've defined here is a rule customization. So one rule that gets shipped but does not do anything out of the box, but is very useful once you've configured, is PSU's compatible commandlets. And you can say, I want to develop PowerShell scripts that should work on PowerShell core 6.02 and on desktop 4.0. So, because quite often it happens, to show you practical examples, I got a call from a client. I need a script that zips me up a file, a very simple function at the end, they wanted to have a zip. That was the gist of it. So then you Google, how do you zip up a file? Oh, there's a built-in commandlet called compress archive. Write the script to him, test it on my box, yeah, works fine on my machine. Send it to him, and he uses an automation environment where the system that runs the automation script is administered by admins, and it happened that this machine was running PowerShell version 4, where the compress archive commandlet was not existing, and then it errored out. So this would be very useful if you already know your script will have to run on 4. Then you can have those options, and then the tool will tell you this commandlet is not available in this version. And it not only does it by command, but also parameters. So if a parameter has been renamed, removed, or a parameter set, it will pick this up as well. So this, I think, is very useful if you have to target different PowerShell versions. Here I also have a link where I've set up a full repository, which is kind of the one that I've shown right now here, end-to-end, with lots of examples, documentation on it as well, if you want to see how everything is wired up. So we've done, going back to the presentation, I won't go into details of all of it, but this is basically what is in the module. It's 3 commandlets. In our case, VSCode takes care of it. The extension is calling those commandlets. If you just care about using it in VSCode, then you don't care about this too much, except some details that I will point out. So getScriptAnalyzer rule gives you all rules. To be honest, I don't use it that much, but it's good for testing if you develop custom rules and you want to check you actually get them back. They're being used. Invoke formatter, the only use case that I would see is if you want to auto-format all your scripts of your code base. If you decide on a certain coding standard and maybe you had mixed formatting, then you would use this commandlet where you can pass in your scripts or the content of it. And it would be something like get content of my scripts, piped it to invoke formatter, out file, and then you have auto-formatted your script. But this is what VS Code uses under the hood for the auto-formatting. The essential commandlet is invoke script analyzer that has 2 parameter sets, one for a path and one for just a string. And you can have options for custom rule path or recurse custom rule path if you have more than one rule. So if you have a bunch of files that you want to include. And when you specify custom rules, Script Analyzer will then only use custom rules. If you still want to use your default rules, use this switch here. And you can furthermore customize it, say, exclude from the default rules certain rules, then you supply the exclude rule parameter, or a mutually exclusive parameter is the include rule, which is not very intuitive, but what it does, it's basically saying use only those rules. That's the rules that I want you to use. So using include and exclude together doesn't make much sense. Recurse is if you have a path and you want to traverse through all subdirectories looking for PowerShell files. It looks for PS1 files, PSD1, one files. And there's certain advanced features like the fix. So say some rules can be auto-fixed, like the aliases one. With fix switch, it will fix those rules automatically if you want, for example, all aliases to be replaced by the proper commandlets. If you want a very cheap implementation for CI, use enable exit. It returns an exit code equivalent to the number of warnings. A non-zero exit code results in a build failure. This is just a very cheap option if you have like a minute and you need to get it in. I will show you better practices, but this is just a quick way to do it. And settings. So this is the path to the settings path, that is special settings file. And you can also have a report summary now, similar to Pester. The command itself returns the objects, but you might get 100 objects back. Instead of like analyzing them before, you might just want to have like a very brief summary. Which severity are my warnings? How many are they? So very similar to what Pester reports as a summary. And a special one for DSC is where there's a limitation in the parser. When you use certain commands that are only available once you import at runtime, this switch would go to the PS gallery and fetch the definitions so it can apply more intelligent analysis on scripts. So that was the demo time. Going back to VS Code. In VS Code, when you press Ctrl-Shift-P, you can change your settings. So I could change the workspace settings, and if you start typing for PowerShell .code formatting, and I prefer the JSON view, you get a lot of rules here. And those rules are basically listed here, so those you could check into your VS Code folder. This is basically how you could customize your style, like where you want your braces to be and all of this. All of the default, if you don't want to go through the detail of that, we ship 3 sets, which is Allman, OTPS, and Strustrup. And they ship out of the box. And they represent the 3 most common formatting cases that people use. So the Allman being the traditional style that would be used by C# developers. Then you would have the one brace style, which I would say is more for people coming from a C background, potentially Linux background. And the Strustrup is basically the same, but the if and else are using the same indentation level. With the previous one, the else's are what they call cuddled. They're on the same line as the closing brace. And those 3 styles are usually sufficient for most people. You can customize them by using those settings in VS Code, and it would do it for you. You could also specify those settings in the settings file and then get linter warnings in the editor if you wanted to. Just as a background how it works, or if you want to see how they do it, when you look at the module installation, there is a settings folder, and what you see in there is basically the PSScriptAnalyzer settings files that define this type of code style. So then you could look at examples if you want to slightly tweak it. If you just disagree with one thing, you could take this file as a base and modify it. And what we see in there as well is JSON files, and those are command data files. So what I showed before, we can define the target PowerShell version where we want to develop against. This is how PSScriptAnalyzer knows it will work or will not work, because we store all the commandlets and parameter sets in those JSON files. If you have a special use case, so 6.1 is not in there yet, next release will have 6.1 command data files, or you want to go into details like a special Linux version like Red Hat Enterprise Linux versus Ubuntu, there might be a subtle difference. You can produce them yourself as well. So on our repository, which is on GitHub, so PowerShell/PSScriptAnalyzer, we have this script called new command data file. All you do is you just run the file, no parameters, it doesn't ask for anything at all, and it will produce that file if you want to use it for your custom environment where maybe you've installed modules or stuff like that. So this is how you could even furthermore customize it. Custom rules. So a very simple example of a custom rule I have in this repository that I've shown before, which we have here, but I want to open it in the editor so I can show it. So the way it works is so you define a function, and what you take in is a command AST. So if you're not familiar with the AST, which is the abstract syntax tree, I'll briefly explain it afterwards. Otherwise, you might have to bear with me for a second. So essentially what we do, we return an object here, which will be the violation. So I'm going to say a message about invoke something is going to happen, severity warning. And in the new version, you can even return suggested corrections, which I will show how they manifest themselves. But all code lines above are just about the setup of the suggested correction. All you actually do is return this object here, which is the violation. And when is it going to be returned? So we analyze the AST coming in, and we say if the command name is invoke something, then return this. So let's look at an example. So we have here invoke something. The rule is already kicking in. How is it kicking in? In my settings.json, I refer to a PSScriptAnalyzer settings path again. So what have I defined here? I have set custom rule path. And now with the new version, you can specify relative paths. So if you have that custom rule checked in as part of your code base, you can reference that relatively, so it will work on any developer's machine out of the box. So this is how I see the squiggly here. But I also see a light bulb. So the light bulb some people might have used already for other ones. This is a message here, and it replaces it with invoke something else. So what this here was the suggested correction. And this is how the replacement of aliases works. For example, it returns what the actual commandlet name is for an alias. If you have a custom rule and you know what the correction would be, please return it. It can be auto-fixed either in VS Code or by using the -fix switch. So this was a very simple example. This is a more complex example. So Lee Holmes has blogged about this. I will link up to this. And I've basically set it up already in a repository. So he has defined a couple of functions here, and those are custom rules that have very fancy and sophisticated logic for detecting code injection. So sometimes you might be running your PowerShell script as a service from a different user on your machine, and you want to make sure the code that you run has been scanned through thoroughly. So if there's user input that has not been validated, there is the potential that you run any kind of arbitrary code. So the point of those custom rules is to point out places where you might be running arbitrary code. So it would give you warnings. If I defined here a string, if this string came from a user, then I would need to double check, that there is validation going on, that a user can't do any arbitrary things. So this is a real-life example of using custom rules integrated into VS Code. And by checking it in, you don't even need to have full hard-coded paths, as he was demoing in his blog post. All of this, the examples here, I will upload to GitHub. There is a GitHub repository for PSSA, and all of those examples will be there, so you can look at them and see for yourself. PSScriptAnalyzer in CI. So some of you said already they are using it in CI. You can do it yourself using Pester. This is a very simple example where you basically go through all rules. So let me look it up where it is. So get script analyzer rule, we get all of them. And we have 2 for each loops where we just assert that there's no failures. Failures at count should be 0. The reason why I do it in Pester is because Pester has the option of outputting an XML file that can be interpreted by your CI system, because it's in a certain format. I think it's NUnit format. I don't remember from the top of my head, but it is a very common format that automation systems like AppWare or Travis CI or Azure DevOps understand. So you would get a UI in terms of test failures if you have some warnings there that were introduced and were not there before. You could have your custom logic of excluding files, excluding certain warnings on certain files, but this would be just a very simple DIY use case where you would still need to wire up some stuff like running Pester, how do you run Pester. By the way, there's a Pester Azure DevOps extension that is very useful, but then you have to still upload a test file and so on and so forth. How about this? So I came across this a few months ago by a French guy, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Mathieu Boisson. And he basically is wrapping Script Analyzer as a PowerShell module, and in addition to that, providing an Azure DevOps extension. And just by looking at his documentation, you can see he's put a lot of effort into it. So I will show this in a second, but you can, I recommend browsing it a bit, seeing what is in it. It is PSScriptAnalyzer plus yes?
Just an FYI, he has a lot of articles on writing custom rules as well that I personally found really useful.
Oh, that would be very good. Maybe we'll have a search and maybe a link to it.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So I will demo this extension in action. So here's the link to the Azure DevOps, or some people might know it from the previous name BSTS extension. It's all on GitHub if you want to raise issues. I was running it against some sample repository which worked fine. The only repository that it didn't work against was the PSScriptAnalyzer repository, which seemed to be a bit odd, but I guess we have in our test folder a couple of files that are deliberately invalid for testing purposes. So I guess that's why it tripped over. But so the demo that I'm going to give here is in Azure DevOps, and I'm also going to show an Azure DevOps feature that was introduced fairly recently. So I'm in incognito mode now, and looking at the build, most people remember Azure DevOps was private only. Now they made it possible to have a public read-only view of a build or a release. So this is kind of to open up more to the open source community. And so any of you can look at this build here. So as an artifact, we have, I will just download the artifact and then have a look at it. It's a zip file which just contains one HTML file, which is the report. A very nice report. You can browse it, look at details. Just by looking at the UI, you can see a lot of effort was put into it, and I think that's quite nice to review of them if the analysis is a bit more complex, where you can drill down what has happened. And as far as I see, he also has some integration with Pester. So coming back to this read-only view, so how did I do that? This is just the result. So there's no edit button, just showing you on this read-only view, you can only see the build results. The build release still Here I'm logged in and can look at the build definition. And the reason why I want to show it to you is how simple it is to set up once it started loading. So this is the custom task here. And if I just were to add this task here, I have all I've done is here ticked generating an HTML report and specified the output path. And I'm using a variable because in the next step I will push it up. So that's two tasks, just specifying where I want my HTML report. And by default it goes through the whole repository. But yes, there's loads of options to customize it on certain paths, include, exclude, and so on. So that I find very convenient. So on your target machine, you don't need to have the tool installed. It will install PSScriptAnalyzer for you and takes care of everything so that it just works out of the box. I'm going to talk now about some internals. So the avoid using Commandlets aliases rule is checking for explicit and implicit aliases. Mainly PSScriptAnalyzer is a static analyzer, but this rule is one of some that kind of breaks this paradigm. When it looks for aliases, it uses your PowerShell session. So I will show that in a bit how that makes an impact. So let's say, for example, we say new minus alias foo for new item. And we use it in our scripts, everything works fine and dandy. And we start using it, but ScriptAnalyzer picks up on it. I've defined something custom here, which I think is very important because it happens quite often that developers have their own custom helper functions on their machines, and then it's works on my machine environment. So this is one reason why it's good to retrieve it from the local machine, but also there's some aliases got dropped or are not there by default on certain platforms. So with PowerShell 6, the curl aliases was dropped because curl is a binary on Linux, so there was a clash. And service is a binary on Linux as well. So when on Windows, curl would be an alias. So if I were to do invoke script analyzer minus script definition curl, it would warn me. So I'm here using the Windows subsystem for Linux, so I don't need to spin up a VM. And when I run invoke script analyzer on service or curl, it doesn't return anything because I'm just calling the binary. So there is some sophisticated logic behind it. Talking about the rule itself, if you think, and I think that might be one step for the future for maybe not warning against common aliases, like for each that aliases for each object. You can customize the rule, you can whitelist it. If you say this and that alias is so common, you can whitelist it. It's just at the moment, by default, it picks up any aliases. But we're open for discussion or pull requests. So if you think the defaults are not appropriate, we're happy to discuss and change it, or you can change it yourself. And if the change is sensible, we're happy to approve. So this is just showing a bit of internals of how it works behind the scenes. There are some known issues, so a lot of people pick up on this rule. I've made a label of its own for this special rule. So the rule, PS use declared variables more than assignments, is limited in terms of it looks only at one script block in terms of scope. It can't see anything else above this script block. So I've done some tweaking to that rule already, but my point of view is we could tweak it further, but it would still not really be perfect. The solution for it would be a complete rewrite using SSA, so a static single assignment form, which has been partially implemented already by taking code from the PowerShell implementation itself, but it has severe limitations. So I've tried it as an example to warn against the operator plus equals, where I would need to determine on the left-hand side there is an object of type array or a variable of type array, and it works in only limited use cases. So looking forward to the future, it would be better to refactor the rule. At the moment, this rule is a bit limited. I think it's still useful. You can declare, okay, this is fine, because in a pester test you might do a before each and then actually use it in your read block. Then you just have to declare it. As yes, I can suppress it in this case. I still find it useful that it points it out. But people have different opinions on it, so that's why the tool is customizable. Some rules I think are a bit outdated and they were discussed a lot and there was no conclusion. So one rule is using BOM encoding for Unicode encoded files. It depends so much on the platform. There were bugs on Windows with certain encodings where things did work on Windows but not on Linux. So there was no end result really. What was a good recommendation? The rule is still in place. The rule actually did help me once when I was running PowerShell on Linux in the beta and alpha days. But in terms of it recommending it or not recommending, not using BOM, it is questionable. So it's up to you to treat it if you think this is correct or not. We've seen some multi-threading issues. So there's heavy locking going on for a command data cache. And sometimes, very, very rarely, like in 1 in 1,000 times, we do see exceptions that happen. And I think this is due to multi-threading because all rules are running in parallel. I have managed to partially reproduce. I have not fully understood the race condition or how to resolve it. What I know for now is it's happening more likely on slow machines. It's very, very rare. You will probably never see it. I'm using Script Analyzer in CI, so it's running 10, 20 times a day. And in a year, it has happened once. So it is rare, but we've seen it happening. So how does it work? Coming back to what is an AST. So one of the developers of PowerShell published a module called Show PSS. It's a module which basically reveals how a script looks like through the PowerShell engine or how you would have to treat it if you were to write a custom rule because you use the abstract syntax tree. So this tool gives you a visual representation of your script on the right. So I could, and this is how I myself learned writing rules and fixing stuff in Script Analyzer. I did not know anything about the AST before. So this is very useful for exploration. So find out what if I don't like my variables to be called foo. Then I could look for a variable expression asked that has a variable path A. And it's just very useful of finding out how the PowerShell parser sees the representation of the script. And this, I think, is very useful if you want to write custom rules, because for custom rules, you need to have an understanding of the abstract syntax tree. A bit of an outlook for the future, what will come in the next version. I've already added a pull request for better tab completion. So if you pipe the results to something else, then you will now get tab completion on whatever properties are available of the violation. A community member has recently opened a pull request, and this has been merged for performance improvement. Because when you open a script in VS Code, it takes a while for you to see the squigglies because it has to run Script Analyzer. And so we should see a performance increase in the next version. Bug fixes as usual. Usually it's existing bugs, not bugs that have been introduced. So I'm kind of working off the backlog a bit. New command data files so that you can use your rules to target 6.1. I will also need to enhance the commandlet that produces those data files because it's currently not catering for a feature that they made when you have using 6.1 with the latest Windows release, so meaning 1809 for Windows Server or Windows Desktop. Then they've added additional capabilities to look in the System32 folder for some out-of-the-box commandlets that are shipped as part of Windows. And those are not part of the command data files. So I will make a special one for those new Windows releases together with 6.1, how the command data files would look like. Microsoft has in the past said they want to enhance version and platform analysis, similar how I demoed using with command data files. There is a pull request open that needs more work on it. At the moment, there's not too many resources from the Microsoft side on it, so I'm not sure if it will get merged for the next version, but this is where Microsoft wants to go in terms of where Microsoft sees it being useful in terms of adding features and maintaining it. And I myself pick up stuff from requests that I think make sense. Things that I'm working on right now is adding new options for having better formatting for braces, pipes, and the indentation levels. And with that, I will ask you, do you've got any questions? How did you find the tool? And thank you very much for your attention. Yes?
One question. So a lot of people start developing their own kind of build process, and part of that is they will invoke the script analyzer and then kind of invoke like a tester to do the sort of tests. Your example, you seem to create a test within Pester that was invoking the script analyzer itself, right?
Yes.
Do you find that's a better way of doing it rather than kind of having two separate steps?
It depends on your in Azure DevOps. I would recommend using PSScriptAnalyzer Help. I think both approaches have pros and cons. I wouldn't say either of them is better. Give examples of how you want to use it. So I don't think there's really a favorite. Whatever works best for you, I think, is what makes sense. A disadvantage of the approach that I have shown is, just to point out one thing, is because of the for each, the two for eaches, and the second one being before the each loop, we have 50 rules. If you have 50 files, you have 50 times 50 tests, so you will have a lot of tests. So you might not like seeing that. If you want to have a look at your test results, if you see like 1,000 test results. So that's why it's, I think, pros and cons. The reason why I was using it inside Pester is for being able to produce this XML file that can be interpreted by the CI/CD provider. So I think it depends what works best for your code base. So then say thank you very much for your attention, and yeah.